Wonderful. Okay. Hi, everyone. Nice to see all your faces on screen. Greetings from Jerusalem, from my living room. It would be so much more fun to be able to do this in person, and I look forward to making that happen sometime very, very soon. But in the meanwhile, we are largely stuck on Zoom doing virtual education. But I am very, very hopeful that in the near future we'll be able to welcome folks to come join us in Jerusalem and see most of this in person rather than via your computer screens. I'll just share a few quick words about myself. Some of you have learned with me before. I see a couple of friends out there in the Zoom audience, which is really nice. My name is Jared, again, Jared Goldfarb. Born and raised in the States, born and raised in a Jewish family, not tremendously religious in the sense that while we were very identified as Jews, did not live in a very strong Jewish community. So it was a very sort of quiet Jewish upbringing, you could say. And so for me, living in Jerusalem, being an educator, teaching the history of Judaism as well as many other religions, and really passionate about the history of this land and many of our stories, our textual narratives, our faith traditions. It's really a lot about my own personal journey, not having been raised with a strong sense of Jewish identity, but rather coming to it as a young adult, finding my way to Jerusalem, which was a bit of a surprise for me, but really falling in love with the fact that specifically in this land, as fascinating, as historic, and as complicated as it is, I felt like I had finally found myself. And so largely what I have the blessing to be able to do as a teacher, as a tour guide, for those who have traveled with me in the past, is really to share partly just my own passion for finding my place in this world, within the Jewish community, within the state of Israel, within the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic, whatever realm you wanna think of. That's largely why I do what I do. So, simply by way of introduction, the topic that I will be exploring with you all for the next 4 sessions is largely about my own process of figuring out what it means for me to be Jewish, and along the way, getting to know many of our historical figures, ancestors, inspirational ideas, etc. And so this particular topic I find quite fascinating, trying to understand really the context, the historical context, the textual context, and even a little bit the archaeological context behind the figure of Jesus. So while the series is entitled From Jesus the Rabbi to Christ the Savior, as you may have guessed by reading the description and looking at the various sessions, we're not going to be focusing on Jesus exclusively, but really trying to understand the world that Jesus lived in particular, the land that Jesus lived on, the communities that surrounded Jesus and that Jesus perhaps considered himself a part of, and really try to understand how that helps us learn about Jesus, maybe even on a slightly deeper level. So obviously, as a first session, we want to begin with really setting the scene, trying to understand, before we even get to too many of the characters and too many of the specific stories, really just try to understand the world into which Jesus was born. And so obviously we're gonna drift back about 2,000 years to roughly the time of 0. Obviously the Roman Empire comes into the land that is known as Judea, the ancient land of Israel, the promised land, Canaan. It has many varying names. They come into the picture a number of decades before Jesus is actually born. But perhaps, given some of the topics that we'll be exploring together, really we could go all the way back to the entrance of the Greek Empire 3 centuries before Jesus is born, to really understand some of the cultural and political influences that are going to have a tremendous effect on the Jewish society in Judea, in the Galilee, that will help shape Jesus's own identity, both as a Jew, but also as a resident of a district in the world that is largely being played with, in a sense, ruled by these Western geopolitical influences. So with that said, I think we'll get started on our journey. Given the nature of Zoom and the number of folks that we have with us today, as was already said, while I'd love to create a conversation, that's really challenging to do. So I encourage you all to write your questions in the chat, and then at the end, we'll hopefully have enough time to have a little bit of a conversation about some of this material. Keep in mind that really this whole topic is meant to be kind of a journey over these 4 sessions. So we won't be wrapping up too much today, really just introducing a lot of ideas and themes, and then hopefully we'll be tying them all together as we proceed through the remaining 3 sessions over the next few weeks. So at this point, I'm going to share my screen. Bear with me a second here. Hopefully you'll soon see my screen. There we go. Again, the session or the series entitled From Jesus the Rabbi to Christ the Savior. Today, we're going to be setting the scene, the geopolitical reality of the Holy Land under the Roman Empire. And before we go any further in terms of my presentation or some of the themes we want to cover, since I don't know necessarily where you're all from, and I don't know how many of you may have been to the Holy Land, and if so, how many times and how deep you've been able to explore this place, I thought we'd start with just a little bit of basic geography in getting to know the land, because obviously that's really going to be our starting point for understanding this world of Jesus 2,000 years ago. So here we are on this particular side of the planet. We have a wonderful representation in our Zoom classroom from all sorts of different corners of the earth. But here we are taking a look at the Middle East and North Africa. And as we start to zoom in, we kind of focus in on what we might call the Middle East, specifically the Mediterranean coastal region. And so this is an area that, at least in our textual tradition, is introduced to us as the land of Canaan, which will then give birth to many other names as different communities and different traditions form relationships with this land. And so here we are taking a look, and you can see some of the outlines of obviously the modern day nation states like Israel and Egypt and Jordan, Lebanon and Syria. And if we zoom in a little bit further, we will see the kind of the focal point really of where our story will lead. It may not start here, but the province of Judea, the sort of central district of the entire ancient land of Israel, is really where a lot of the most interesting and most important events will take place. And obviously we'll be fleshing those out as we continue on this journey. But of course, we also need to get to know the northern district, known as the Galilee, where Jesus is born and raised. I apologize if you can hear the background noise. The timing is rather unfortunate. If you heard a whoosh there for a minute, that is because just now the state of Israel and the state of Germany have decided to do a joint Air Force exercise literally right over my house. So hopefully that won't interrupt us too many times. Back to our map, we're looking at the northern region of the Galilee, the rolling hills, the Sea of Galilee, also known as the Kinneret. And this is also a very important part of the geography of Jesus and the geography of the Roman presence in the Holy Land. And so we're going to come back to these areas in a bit. But for now, we'll head back to the presentation and we'll take a look at the topography of the land itself. Again, many of you might be familiar with the land, having traveled it, having really gotten to understand the stories and the history here. But just to make sure we're all on the same page, very, very briefly, we are talking about a land with some very distinct regions, distinct districts that are going to play out both in terms of the development of the history up until Jesus, right? Meaning Jesus born into this Jewish world in the quote unquote promised land, we assume would know how the history, his own history played out, so that he has a relationship with different areas of the land and probably feels very, very differently about some areas as opposed to other areas, which is critical to know. For example, if you can see my mouse on your screen, we are looking in the central district here of the highlands or the mountain region, the land that gives us the hilltop cities of Jerusalem and Bethlehem and Hebron, in addition to the northern Samarian cities of Shechem, otherwise known as Shechem. And so we have the central mountain spine, you could say, of the land, the Holy Land. And then parallel to that, closer to the Mediterranean coastline, we have an area known as the lowlands, as well as the coastal plain. So you can see there's a fairly distinct difference within that central part of the Holy Land between those communities that are on the high ground. And this, of course, brings us back to the core of much of our early biblical narrative. And of course, I'm referring to the Hebrew Bible stories, as opposed to the coastal plain, where we see the cities of Jaffa and Ashkelon. This map also makes reference to some of the modern names like Tel Aviv and Haifa, which are not part of our biblical heritage, but nonetheless reflect the coastal communities. And this is an area that perhaps is slightly lesser known to the core of that Hebrew biblical narrative, simply because of the way the stories played out in the earlier books, right? But we're going to be focusing on the life of Jesus. So we're talking about after the end of most of that early Hebrew biblical narrative. I want you to notice that if you look sort of in the upper left of this topographical map, you will see a fairly distinct division between the central mountain spine, right, where Jerusalem and Bethlehem and Hebron are, and all the way in the upper left corner, you can see the Galilee region, the upper Galilee, the lower Galilee, and how they are divided by this very green valley of Jezreel, Yisrael in Hebrew. And that is important to understand because it plays into the way that the Roman Empire and its client rulers, right, those who are locally based, who are going to be ruling on behalf of the Roman Empire, are going to understand this land. And so that is a very important distinction, just to remember that there are essentially two different hill countries: the central spine of Jerusalem and Judah, and the northern hills of the Galilee. Divided, of course, by the valley of Jezreel that spills out into what in modern day we would simply call the Haifa Bay. Perhaps in ancient times we could refer to it as the Akko or Acre Bay, since they both sit on the same inlet. And so we have those two major hill regions, atop both of which we are going to find ancient and very important Jewish communities. If we were to go back all the way to the tribal territories, for example, we would see how both of those hill countries are being settled by the early arrivals of the Israelite tribes. And so these are areas, once again, that Jesus would know well. By this point, Jesus is not only familiar with his Galilee surroundings, but very, very familiar with, of course, the district of Judah or Judea, because the role that Jerusalem plays in every Jew's life, largely having to do with the pilgrimage ritual, the centrality of the temple in Jerusalem, and of course, the holiday rituals surrounding sacrifice that take place in that temple. So now that we have an initial glimpse of the geography and the topography of the land, we can move forward to another map, one that is a little bit more relevant to the time period 2,000 years ago, where we can see the various districts of the land according to the Roman Empire and according to many of the local communities as well. And so here as well, we can see that the central district of Judea and Samaria are a separate category from the upper hills of the Galilee in the north. And of course, some basic information that we need to understand, again, setting the scene, the background to the world that Jesus is born into. Right before Jesus is born, of course, we have the tremendous influence of King Herod the Great, who is going to rule as a client king for 30 plus years until his death around the time of the birth of Jesus, after which the leadership following his life is going to be divided, at least in the areas that we're going to concern ourselves, amongst three of his sons. So starting in the north, we have Philip, who is going to rule the territories that are to the north and east of the Sea of Galilee, also known as the Kinneret. Many of you may be familiar with the name of the community Caesarea Philippi, which of course is Caesarea of Philip, right? The name of the leader of the Roman Empire, Caesar, and of course Philip, who takes over control of that region. Closer to the shore of the lake is another community called Bethsaida, which some of you may be familiar with, just on the northeast corner of the Sea of Galilee. Then in the central northern district, we have, of course, the Galilee, which is ruled by Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas, another of the sons of King Herod the Great, featuring, of course, in the New Testament tradition. And these cities are probably even better known by most around the world, such as Tiberias, Sepphoris, and Nazareth. Now, Herod Antipas also ruled over the region east of the Jordan River that you can see on the map, Perea, but we're not going to be focusing too much on that region. But the Galilee, of course, is what's important here. And that is a distinct district ruled by Herod Antipas. And then coming down into the central district of Judea and Samaria, Herod's son Archelaus is going to rule over that region, which includes Jerusalem and Bethlehem and the city that we're going to explore together today, Caesarea, or known as Caesarea. But that rule is rather short-lived, perhaps because of the perception of the effectiveness of the rule itself of Herod Archelaus, but also perhaps because of the role that Jerusalem plays, the role that that coastal region is going to play in the influence of Rome. And so it eventually is going to be taken over more or less directly by Rome, and Augustus Caesar is going to bring in sort of their own team, leaders known as procurators or prefects, probably the most famous of which we will be talking about today very briefly, Pontius Pilate. And they are going to ostensibly rule directly, but rely heavily on local leadership. For example, the priestly class of the Jewish community, largely centered in Jerusalem. So for example, if you're familiar with the name Caiaphas or Caiapha, one of the high priests ruling around the time of Jesus, there is a tremendous connection, a necessary connection between the priestly rule and the procurators over Judea in order to solidify that rule and, of course, keep the workings of the Roman Empire and their interests in this region going smoothly. So here we have a little bit of that kind of geopolitical breakdown, understanding what is going on in the region. But again, I want to stress that there is a fairly distinct difference between the northern territory of the Galilee and the central territory of Judea, right? That you might be familiar with that distinction, and I'll just bring a couple of texts that you may be familiar with, just to point out how this perhaps gets reflected. In Matthew 26, we have a story that is mostly about Peter, but it sort of maybe accidentally brings out one of these distinctions that I'm relating to. So we read here in verses 69 to 75, now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. A servant girl came to him and said, "You also were with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before all of them, saying, "I do not know what you are talking about." When he went out to the porch, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again, he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you are also one of them, for your accent betrays you." And so here we can hear, apparently, and back then you could hear the difference between a Galilean and a Judean. And Mark 14 echoes that same story with a slightly different take, where the bystanders come to Peter to say, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean," right? So whether we are hearing the accent, whether we are seeing perhaps a little bit of the maybe facial features, or we simply know that there is a distinction between the various communities, it's just important to recognize that there are a couple of different Jewish worlds that exist in the Holy Land 2,000 years ago. We might want to kind of lump them all in together, but I think it's important to see how there are some differences. And the reason I mention it, of course, is because in later sessions, we're going to be focusing on some of those differences. Maybe not so much the geographic ones, but this just helps us kind of ease into that world where the distinctions between various Jewish communities are only going to grow more and more vast, to the point where many of you know what's coming, of course, if you know your history, that much of the strife that the Jewish community is going to see 2,000 years ago, especially just following the lifetime of Jesus, is largely attributed to the internal ruptures within the Jewish world. And so we start out somewhat innocently with various geographic distinctions, and we're then going to see that play out, those different identities, as we move into religious differences, political differences, sectarian differences, theological differences, you name it, across the board. The Jews are going to struggle with this concept of being united with one story. And of course, that then will become relevant as we move towards the end of our journey together, when we start to understand some of the figures that are going to attempt to either solve that crisis or at least be seen as leadership figures to navigate the way forward from that crisis. And so already some of you might be thinking, oh, yes, we're talking about messiahs, right? This notion that maybe out of strife will come some sort of God-appointed leadership or a figure to really behold that has answers, that has insight and wisdom. And so part of the need for that spiritual, sacred, almost ethereal leadership is going to come from the tension that exists within the various communities on the ground. So we won't go into that anymore for now, but again, we're just setting up some of our themes as we track these various issues. Okay, now what we want to do is we're going to switch back over to Google Earth and appreciate, oh, And you may be hearing that the Air Forces are once again flying over my home. So I apologize for any of the background noise. Here back on Google Earth, we want to now appreciate that as the Jews are starting to navigate more and more this intense and hands-on Roman influence, especially following the leadership of Herod, right? Just as an aside, for those who may feel slightly less familiar with the personality of Herod, we often very much understand him to be a kind of a Roman puppet, or at least representing many of the Roman interests. But we also have to remember that he is born and bred in this land. And many historians, partly due to a few textual hints, also maybe partly due to the historical development that happens under Herod's rule, often think that Herod had perhaps an affection for, maybe even an affinity to the Jewish world. And so that question mark, or that possible, potential relationship between the Jews on the ground, or the people of the earth, so to speak, and the ruling authorities, is going to become strained as we move beyond Herod to the rule of his sons, which by and large is not very successful. And then we see the kind of the direct influence of those Roman procurators, representing, of course, Caesar himself, right? The ruler of the empire. And so as we witness those political changes, we're also going to start to see changes on the ground. And this is going to lead us, of course, to our more visual experience today. So first and foremost, oops, not quite yet, hold on. As we're still here in the Galilee, you can see marked on the map the city of Tiberias that sits on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. Tiberias is a city, as you may know, that was established only during the lifetime of Jesus. While Herod Antipas was ruling in the north, he decides to build a very new, very modern city right at the edge of the lake, and clearly is going to be paying homage to his overlords, if you will, the Emperor Tiberius himself. And so naming Tiberias as such, and as we witness the development of the city, we can see more and more of that on-the-ground Roman influence. So if we go back to our presentation here, we see a sort of an artist's depiction of the city of Tiberias, based partly on some of the archaeological excavations that have taken place there. And while we know for sure that there were many Jews who were living in Tiberias, we also have texts that point to non-Jews who were living there. And certainly even just a quick glance at this image, again, stemming from some of the archaeological work in the area, we know that there was perhaps an indication of Roman culture that is going to seep in, this Western world that is coming across the Mediterranean to infiltrate Judea and the Galilee. I say this just in introduction. We're not going to be focusing on the city of Tiberias today, but of course you might be familiar with it. But rather, we want to focus on a different city, one that is going to play a much more intense role in everything that develops as the background to the story of Jesus. And that essentially is what's going to bring us to our virtual tour for today. And that is over here on the Mediterranean coast. As we can see, our orientation sort of shifts to look west, and we are now looking at the area of Caesarea or Caesarea, right? One of the largest archaeological excavations in the land today, certainly one of the favorites, and that has a lot to do with the simple enormity of structures left behind. And that obviously says a lot about the investment of the development of this area to begin with. The more you put in to the physical structures, the more, as far as they were concerned, that would hopefully last the test of time. And so here on the Mediterranean coast, we find ourselves at Caesarea. And so now I want to try to introduce a little bit about where Caesarea is coming from, how we might understand its role. So first, we want to go back to this map that we looked at earlier, the map of the various districts under Roman influence 2,000 years ago. And if you look along the Mediterranean coastal plain, starting in the south and making our way north, you will see names like Gaza, a very ancient, very important port city, largely serving the Egyptian influence and the Philistine communities that were here during the early biblical period. Moving up the coast to the north, we find ourselves at Jaffa, a very central port, probably one of the most relevant port cities, certainly to the Israelite presence in the land, given its centrality and its proximity to Jerusalem up on top of the hill. And then all the way in the north, just past what we refer to as the shoulder of the coastal plain, we see a city marked here as Ptolemais, also known as the city of Akko or Acre. And you can see the bay, what today we refer to as the Bay of Haifa. And that was also a very important port city. In addition, the further we go north into historic Phoenician territory, today modern Lebanon, you'll see the port cities of Tyre and Sidon. But those are slightly less relevant to our central district. So essentially the question that one might ask is, with so many port cities in a relatively small piece of land, why might we need an additional one? It is important to remember that the city of Caesarea, as we will explore it, didn't really exist as a city up until it is created by King Herod just before the birth of Jesus. And so one might wonder why we would need another port city on this land that for thousands of years has done quite well without it, with the pre-existing port cities like Gaza, Jaffa, and Akko. So we can make many different guesses, but certainly as we witness now the development of the city of Caesarea, we might understand that it could have a lot to do with starting from scratch to really assert one's identity. And in this case, we're going to largely be looking at the kind of Roman aspect of Herod's own identity. Even though, as I mentioned before, he was born and raised in this land, may have even felt a closeness to the Jewish tradition, or at least to the Jewish people, but nonetheless, he very much ruled on behalf of Rome. We know that he was very close with many figures in the Roman world, and that essentially his rule was devoted to the glorification of the Roman Empire to a certain extent. And so being able to assert that identity and that influence by creating your own port city with your own cultural, political identification, and then not only that, but strengthening the city to become an economic center, maybe that was the major influence in deciding that this teeny little piece of real estate on the Eastern Mediterranean needed yet another port. And so just to give us an understanding of how perhaps surprising, maybe even radical it was for Herod to embark on this project, we need to look no further than the most important historian of that era, who is Josephus, himself a Jew from the land of Israel. And we read here a couple of different descriptions of the situation before Herod gets to work. In Jewish wars, we are told along the coast, Herod discovered a city that was in decay named Straton's Tower. The stretch of coastline from Dora to Jaffa, between which the city lies, was completely devoid of harbors, so that every ship sailing from Egypt along the coast of Phoenicia had to ride at anchor in open when menaced by southwest wind, for even a moderate breeze from this quarter dashes the wave to such a height against the cliffs that their reflux spread a great commotion far out to sea. Josephus making it very, very clear that this particular stretch of Mediterranean coast was not ship-friendly. You might be asking yourself, why on earth would I want to build a port then? We're going to get to that in a second. Josephus then continues in Antiquities. The city is located in Phoenicia on the sea route to Egypt between Jaffa and Dora. There are small towns on the seashore and are poor harbors because the southwest wind beats on them and always dredges up sand from the sea upon shore and thus does not permit smooth landing. Instead, it is usually necessary for merchants to ride unsteadily at anchor offshore. Again, emphasizing the fact that this is just not a port-friendly area. And so perhaps the challenge of outdoing nature, as we see Herod attempt again and again and again throughout his lifetime, throughout his rule, and throughout this land, perhaps this is going to be another wonderful example of that, because Herod has to essentially create that friendliness for ships to be able to dock and do what they need to do, unload their merchandise. So here we now have a beautiful aerial view of the entire national park, the archaeological site that is known as Caesarea. And probably most importantly, if you see right here, what looks to be the major kind of bay of Caesarea, this is entirely artificial, right? And that's where essentially our story begins, at the port, before any of the other structures or areas of Caesarea are developed. And so for this, here we have a nice kind of computer artistic rendering of what that part might have looked like, given not only the stories of the construction of the port, but also some of its archaeological remains. And this is perhaps the lesser known story of Caesarea, because people get a little distracted by all the wonders of the architectural elements on the shore. But in fact, this is where the story begins. And so in order to create what did not exist, right? The reason why this is a computer artistic rendering is because there was nothing there before. And Herod had to essentially create it from scratch. And quite famously, we learn, thanks to an architectural text from 2,000 years ago by a very famous Roman architect, Vitruvius, there was a relatively new technology of the time that used volcanic ash, which was clearly more prevalent in the central Rome district than it was in the ancient land of Israel, where we don't have a lot of active volcanoes at the time. But certainly because of the trade, volcanic ash was able to be imported, and it was combined with some of the lime and silica, which were quite prominent in the local geology. And when you mix that ash and lime silica mixture with water, it hardens and creates cement. And so what we're looking at here is a drawing of what Josephus describes to us in his telling of the construction of Caesarea, of these enormous wooden rafts that were built to contain the dry mixture, that were then essentially floated out into the Mediterranean and anchored in place to create what will become the harbor. And then as they are filled with additional material and these huge wooden rafts start to sink to the bottom of the Mediterranean, the cement, as we would call it today, hardens, and the raft essentially becomes an underwater foundation upon which one might build all of the structures that you need to create a safe harbor, such as a breakwater, such as a lighthouse. So if we go back to this rendering, you can see here all of those architectural elements that you see that look like they're kind of floating on water are essentially resting upon these foundations where this technology was implemented for the first time in this land. And that was considered quite a feat by none other than Herod the Great. who is going to radically reshape not just the coastal experience, but really the entire identity of the land, as Caesarea is going to grow to become one of the most central and influential cities because of all of the economic opportunity coming in through the harbor. What's really fascinating today, of course, is that from a bird's eye view above that same harbor, on a perfect day where the water is still, you can see through the water and notice that while there are some elements of architecture left from 2,000 years of Caesarea's existence, if you look out into the water, you can still see some of the foundations of that Herodian construction underwater today. As a matter of fact, there is a dive shop where you can rent scuba gear and take a little kind of laminated museum guide with you and go scuba diving underwater to see some of those foundations of the city of Caesarea, or the port anyways. It's quite fascinating that it still exists, although obviously much of the beauty that was created on top of those foundations to make Caesarea into this amazing city no longer exists. And that simply has to do with the amount of time that has passed since, and all of the squabbles between various communities over control of this, what now becomes a very important city. Moving beyond the port itself, and now I'm going to move a little bit faster because I want to get to maybe one of the more critical elements of our journey today. But just to kind of give you a little bit of a visual experience as we travel through Caesarea, once you've docked your boat in the harbor of Caesarea, you would come ashore and immediately head to a structure that recently looked a little bit like this. It was a bit of a mess because it was undergoing reconstruction. And today it looks like this. And essentially what you're looking at here, the four glass windows that you can see under the arches, where you can make them out in the context of this structure today. This was the foundation of the great temple at Caesarea, something that may have looked like this, just an artist rendition, not necessarily completely accurate, but essentially the notion being that once you have unloaded and you have gotten off the boat, perhaps your duty, your obligation is to recognize that you are alive after this journey, you have made it ashore, you are able to continue on your way with your merchandise, to make your money, enjoy your life, simply because of the gods, right? The gods have played to your favor, and you then must offer tribute to those gods in the temple, on the altar of Caesarea. This temple dedicated to Augustus Caesar, King Herod's patron, the ruler of the Roman Empire. And so again, that's what has now been turned into the brand new, it just opened about 1.5 years ago, visitor center in the National Park of Caesarea. So we have that kind of Roman religious element, if you will, although clearly it is very much intertwined with the political element, right? With Augustus Caesar being not only the Roman emperor, but also very much the god in human form. Moving beyond that into the market space, conveniently attached to the port area, we have here a beautiful, beautiful a remnant of the bathhouse, which was right in the center of the city, right in the middle of the marketplace, not uncommon for bathhouses in the Roman Empire. And so here we can see some of the very intricate architectural design of what is known as the Hippocaust, the structure that allows a furnace to be able to pump hot air, piping hot air under the floor of the bathhouse, upon which the water would sit, which creates a little bit of the steam needed to allow for the enjoyment of your time in a bathhouse. So you can sit naked with your friends in downtown Caesarea and really enjoy a good schwitz, as we might say today. So a lot of again, very modern for that period Roman technology going into the design of the place. The bathhouse, a place, given its central location within the market, clearly not a very private, intimate experience, but rather a very public experience, right? You're naked amongst the masses, discussing city activities, discussing politics, discussing religion, whatever the topic of conversation might be, you're doing it right in the center of town. So the bathhouse isn't really about the water. It's certainly not about cleanliness or hygiene. It's very much about Roman culture and your participation in that culture. And you'll see how a lot of this is going to get reflected in our textual component in just a moment. Moving on from the bathhouse, we are now looking at a nice aerial view of the Hippodrome at Caesarea, the horse racing arena, where a certain athletic component of the city was sort of becomes a shining light. Many of the horse races, which, as you might know, were not necessarily just about athletic ability, but also very much about your status as a warrior. Whether or not you finished first was perhaps slightly less important than whether or not you actually finished the race, meaning this was very much a blood sport. And so the enjoyment of the spectators at such an event was not just about watching, horses run really fast, but really watching about how the chariot racers would essentially try to kill each other as they are racing around the track 7 times. And so there's a lot of blood spatter and gore, and we have this in many textual elements. So it's really very much a kind of a blood sport. Once again, I'm highlighting that to understand the influence of Roman culture as opposed to a local Judean culture, which may not have been such a big fan of such a blood sport. Moving on, we have remnants or really a reconstruction of what was probably Herod's palace. Given the importance, the rising importance of Caesarea, we're going to see Herod have a presence here as well as in Jerusalem. And so as we move from the more residential area of his palace towards the water, we're going to see kind of a colonnade, a bit of a courtyard for hosting, for enjoyment, and maybe most impressive as you move right towards the edge of the palace on the water, we still can make out, as you see here in the outline, within the Mediterranean Sea, what is believed by many to be a swimming pool. Not only just any swimming pool, but actually a freshwater swimming pool where people could bathe and enjoy themselves within the confines of the palace quarters. So again, a tremendous amount of creativity, technology, and certainly Roman cultural influence are going into this whole experience here in Caesarea. One element that probably important to mention, you can't miss it really when you're in the palace of King Herod in Caesarea, is this stone that was uncovered in that area. And you can see here a very vague inscription that did not survive entirely. And here, of course, is the translation, where we read, and a lot of this is, of course, guesswork, filling in some of the parts of the words that are missing, but it is believed to read, "To the divine Augustus, this Tiberium, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has dedicated this." Whatever the inscription might be referring to, the importance here is that it is the only inscription found that makes reference to the procurator himself, Pontius Pilate, who later on will play a very critical role, obviously, in the life and death of Jesus. So that stone was uncovered here in the early 1960s during the archaeological excavations in Caesarea. We'll come back to these stories and these personalities. I just wanted to show it here because it is prominently displayed in this area when you visit. And of course, lastly, we would be quite remiss if we didn't mention the Grand Theater of Caesarea, an absolutely amazing specimen of architecture, holding perhaps somewhere in the vicinity of 8,000 visitors, with a somewhat stunning sea view, although most of that sea view would have been blocked by a huge scenery set in order to help tell the story that would be acted out on stage for the viewers who are coming to the theater at Caesarea. For those who don't know, much of the history, the early history of these theaters, is largely dedicated to the performance of stories about the gods, which are very, very important to understand in terms of how that, what we might think of as an artistic expression, really becomes quite political and theological, given that the stories are about a culture that really has nothing to do with the local Judean identity, but rather the way that all of the gods intermingle with each other, have children together, and the various realms of the living earth that they control. That complex world of gods were acted out on the stage almost as an educational experience for people to really understand the effect that the gods had on their lives.
Jared, I think,
yes.
Do you have, I think maybe we will move some questions, or do you want to finish very quickly?
Yeah, I have one more piece that I really was hoping to get to. Okay. Although the truth is we could save it for the next session. Maybe given the time aspect, that would be best. Okay. And so why don't I do this? I'll wrap up with a couple of sentences while I have just a short video here, just to be able to appreciate kind of a live aerial view of the archaeological excavations of Caesarea. And as it's playing in the background, I'll just continue to share with you that while we're looking at one of the most important archaeological sites, especially as an expression of the success of Herod the Great, but also very much the influence of the Roman Empire on the land of Israel and the Judean culture, I want us just to kind of think of a couple of key bullet points in preparation for next week as we move forward and flesh out some of these ideas. First and foremost, as I started with, we have the distinction of various Jewish identities, right? We should not be fooled into thinking that all of the Jews living in the Holy Land were of one mind, whether it comes to politics or religion, anything at all. We're going to start to see some of those various communities continue to develop away from one another, and we'll take a look at that in a future session. As we look also at the city of Caesarea, we are reminded of some of the various elements that play strongly within the Roman culture, but are going to challenge Jewish culture, right? Essentially, how does the marketplace and some of the structures of the marketplace, like we saw the bathhouse, how does that play into a world where Jews, like Jesus, for example, need access to a local economy, but perhaps feel more and more threatened by some of the cultural elements, like people bathing in the nude in the middle of that marketplace, right? The temple of Augustus, we could see how that is clearly going to conflict with the somewhat historical monotheistic nature of the Judean culture, right? How on earth can we work in this realm of all of this God worship when that is largely what the Hebrew Bible was trying to get the Jews to move away from? And lastly, when it comes to the entertainment component, how can a Jewish world start to blend with a world that sees entertainment intertwined with the politics and the religion of a culture that, on a certain sense, maybe threatens the history of the local community? So we'll flesh out those ideas in the next session. But for now, let's open it up to a couple of quick questions.
Thank you, Jared. Very, very bright and very informative as usual. So we have a first question. Someone is asking, how come Caesarea Philippi disappeared? While, for example, other important cities like Jaffa or Gaza until today remained?
Good question. The truth is that up until recently, the city of Caesarea really hadn't been thought of as disappeared. It was very, very present for many, many hundreds and hundreds of years, really right up until the late Muslim Empire. It was being used not necessarily perhaps as Herod had intended, in terms of its centrality, its political influence, really even its economic influence. But we can see from the many, many layers of archaeology at Caesarea that it lasted long beyond the Roman Empire. And it was really just perhaps a short stint until the middle of the 19th century, when Caesarea was revived as one of many Zionist projects. And then later on, because of the excavations that took place, has become really one of the shining stars of the modern state of Israel's archaeological experience. So if we look at the layers of Jaffa, we look at the layers of Akko, we actually see a lot of similarities with the layers of Caesarea. But you're right, there was a kind of a moment in time where, at least as a civilian community, Caesarea took a brief hiatus until it came back, but it wasn't that long.
Yeah. Thank you. Someone was struck by the beginning when you showed the general view about the place was very green around here, and was a lot of beige around. Like, it seems there were less agriculture at that time. Is it still the case today? And what can you say about that?
Well, I guess one thing that we can say is that the folks who took the satellite images that Google Earth uses picked a very good time of year to use the particular images, given that this land, by and large, has two very distinct seasons to it. One could easily be referred to as the rainy season. It is rather brief, no more than 2 to 3 months. And the rest of the year could easily be described as the hot and dry season. So while by and large, we have a very brown landscape, luckily, during the rainy season, there is much, much green. The land very much comes alive. We see it both in the hill country of Jerusalem and even more so pronounced in the hill country of the Galilee. And that often surprises people for two reasons. One is the very simple fact that if you look on a map at the land called Israel/Palestine, right, meaning between the northern border, the southern border, the Mediterranean, and the Jordan River, that land is a little bit more than 60% desert. And so the simple land mass often misleads people into thinking that the entirety of the land is sort of desert or desert influenced. The second reason why we're often misled has a lot to do with our biblical narratives. We often read about the many stories that take place in these kind of wilderness areas, even after folks arrive in the promised land. And we often forget to focus on the stories of the arrival in the land and the settling down and the beauty of the natural elements, the rivers, the forests even, and specifically the crops that are keeping society alive. So there is actually a lot more green than people often have embedded in their images of the Holy Land, and thank God for that.
Thank you. Someone is asking, how could Herod afford all this expensive infrastructure? Where did the money come from in the peasant society?
Well, first of all, Herod was a very successful king on many fronts. One of those fronts, first and foremost, before he even became king, were the alliances that he formed with many within the influential echelons of Roman society, specifically the political echelons. And so there was a lot of support for Herod as king that was coming in the form of money. And one aspect that we didn't focus on too much in terms of our visual or our virtual visit to Caesarea was that once the city is established and the port is successfully constructed, it essentially draws all economic traffic away from all of the historical port cities and really funnels it into Herod's bank account, you could say, right? Meaning all of the economy essentially wants to go through Caesarea because it is the new shining star of Judea. And the more economy that comes in through that port city essentially translate into more tax earnings for Herod, for the Roman Empire, to be able to then fund all of his other projects that are going on. And in addition, we know from the textual elements like Josephus that Herod taxes quite heavily many of the other activities and the other regions of the country. So there's a lot of money that is coming both from locals as well as from the international economic community.
Okay, and from where you got all this manpower to build such a city as well?
So a lot of the really the technical knowledge we know is imported from other areas of the Roman Empire. The locals were not necessarily well versed in cutting edge technology like what I had described for the building of the underwater foundations to create the port in the first place, without which the rest of the city of Caesarea wouldn't exist. However, most of the day-to-day labor we know was largely coming from the people of the land. And we have to assume that that was predominantly Jewish labor. There's always going to be some slave labor, as we see all throughout history and empires, but a lot of it is simply just employment. The fact that it's not such a secret, even today, that in many cultures, in many regions of the world, governments are sometimes the largest employers by initiating public works projects in order to provide jobs and keep people busy. The more that people are busy, the more that they're earning an income, the less inclined that they either have an intention or time to revolt, to challenge your authority. And so most of the labor is coming from the land of Judea.
Thank you very much, Jared. Thank you very much for this great presentation. One of the comments was someone remembering how your gifted teacher you are, and a participant from a CEP program was very happy to have you here with her today. So thank you very much. And we are all looking forward to see you next week. I have the last question I wanted to ask, but maybe it will be more related to the next session. Maybe if you allow me, it was just about, it seems that this opening to the Mediterranean world kind of gave a consciousness of a more universal consciousness of the people living in Israel, not only being between tribes, but something more open to diversity, like at the crossroad of civilization. Is that true?
I would say very much so. And I maybe this is a good way to end sort of as a teaser. So thank you for the very convenient segue. But the next session that we'll have next week will start off with some of the kind of the cultural intersection between the local Judean community and this ever-growing Roman influence coming from the Mediterranean. And we're going to take a look at some of the Jewish textual elements like the Mishnah and the Talmud that are going to show us quite boldly how, on one hand, the Jews of the land, including Jesus for that matter, are being challenged by these new elements that are really playing with very ancient traditions of how Jews were used to living their lives in their sacred land. But on the other hand, they're also going to show us how the Jews are able to adapt, maybe be a little bit flexible, even to incorporate some of these external influences into their own Jewish world. The level to which you're able to adapt or preserve, right? Those are two critical words for our next session. Adapt or preserve. The level to which you're able to do one or both of those things are largely going to define where on the spectrum of Jewish identity you might fall. So when we read, the New Testament, for example, and understand that Jesus has varying relationships with different other Jews, we can understand that is largely because people are going to start to identify themselves differently depending on how they're able to relate to the Roman influence. So with that, we'll end as a teaser. You have to tune in next week when we'll look at those texts and we'll explore how the Jewish world is going to sort of erupt in this passionate, debate over how do Jews move forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jared, and we are looking forward to be with you next week. So now we're going to have a time of a spiritual reflection that will be led by Father Jean-Paul, Director of Temple.
Well, thank you, Jared, for this presentation and for really pointing out the structure at the time of Jesus, as I think focusing on the political, the religious, and the geographical importance of the areas at the time of Jesus. It makes me think that Caesarea and Herod as a great builder, it really reflected the main power structure of the time. And so the building of such a great city like Caesarea is really a nod, a bow, a recognition of the power structure of the time, the Roman Empire. And so what also strikes me is that this power structure, as you just mentioned, stood in opposition to that local culture and customs. And yet at the same time, it was luring the local culture into buying into the dominant culture. So that raises just a few things within me. So bear with me as I try to give some reflections about the impact as I understand the influence of power structures upon us. I want to begin by simply stating that, one of the people in history that I have a great respect for and a real admiration for is the Native American leader of the Comanche tribe, Quanah Parker. Quanah Parker lived in the second half of the 19th century. He died around 1911. Quanah Parker, later on in his life, was being interviewed by a journalist from back east. And the journalist came to Quanah's home in Texas, in this remote area that at one time was part of the Comanche Empire. And he really wanted to find out from Quanah Parker, what happened to the Comanche people? What happened to native cultures? And so they met on this park bench that Quanah had in his yard. And in a very traditional Native American way, he answered the man's questions by telling stories about Native culture, stories about his growing up, how the people used to live. And as he told his stories, he would slide a little bit closer and closer to the newsman, the journalist. And the journalist would slide a little bit farther away, wanting to keep a certain social distance. Well, as Quanah kept getting closer and closer to the guy, and as he kept moving a little farther and farther away from Quanah, eventually the journalist falls off the bench. And Quanah Parker just simply smiles and looks at him and just says, "Does that answer your question?" When I was growing up, we felt very comfortable at home in our little Arabic neighborhood. And we were used to customs and procedures and norms that defined who we were and how we would relate to each other. These things gave us our identity. However, we were also really quite aware of what to experience when we left our familiar surroundings and entered into a much larger, much more dominant society and culture. What I also experienced was how that dominant culture and society had an impact and an influence upon me, for good and for not so good. In my parents' and grandparents' generation, it meant that the old ways could often be in conflict with the new ways. We're not in the old country anymore. We're in modern world. And so therefore, it was an invitation to be rooted and grounded in one way, in one identity, while at the same time being open to experience, to change, and adaptation to another way. But it could also provide a conflicted identity. Also, in my early years as a Jesuit, I spent many years amongst Native peoples, the Lakota people in South Dakota. And what I encountered there was very much the same thing. Old ways being faced head on with a dominant culture that could overpower and oftentimes devalue the traditional ways. And so the challenge, how does one walk in both worlds? How do I be faithful to what has formed me? And how do I live that out with integrity as I walk in another world? In other words, to use some of the words of Jesus, he refers to his disciples as being in the world, but not of this world. Or remember, you are salt for the world, salt that adds something to the world, salt that flavors something, that makes it even better. And he would also talk about how his disciples were called to be like yeast that allowed something good to transform something else. But we can be misled into something. We can lose our identity, or we can approach it with a sense of identity and assist in transforming. So Jared made reference to the Holy Land being a land that has had a variety of foreign power structures that have dominated this region throughout our history. And so the Romans, but before the Romans, the Greeks, before them, the Assyrians, the Persians, before them, the Egyptians, and of course, Scripture relays the conflict between the Philistines and the Israelites. It's a political structure, a political struggle, as well as a spiritual, economic, and psychological struggle. And so in many ways, the point that I'm making with all of this, I think could be summarized in kind of just the image of David and Goliath. A dominant culture, a dominant force that is somehow trying to impose and stifle a smaller, less powerful structure. And so what gives me pause for reflection in this power structure is the conflict with the cultural and the spiritual values of the people. Establishing new values and new cultural norms, some for the good and some not for so much good. The dominant frequently lures us into its world while unconsciously or subconsciously at times dismissing greater, deeper values. Again, to use some of Jesus' words, he talks about this generation being an evil generation. And I think what he really means by that is that this generation, this dominant culture, can really be misled, and it can mislead. It can cause us to shift our focus on what really gives life to things that are really kind of temporary, flash in the pans, and unfulfilling promises. Where do I experience a dominant power structure or force that conflicts with gospel values? What's my response to all of this? In the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, he invites the retreatants to really contemplate the power of sin in the world, especially sin that is all around us, that somehow permeates and can dominate a larger dominant culture. And he says, as I contemplate those things that mislead me, that misguide me, that want to cause me to somehow lose focus of who I am, what I'm about, he says, we contemplate Jesus on the cross, and we contemplate a Jesus who embraces the cross to bring life to the world by entering into chaos, by entering into dysfunction, by entering into disorder. And he says, ask yourself 3 questions. What have I done in the past to say yes to this? What am I doing now in response to all of this? And what response ought I make? And also in the spiritual exercises, later on, he presents a contemplation, a meditation on the 3 types of people, the 3 classes of people. And again, what he's really inviting us to do is to hit upon the subtle choices within each of us in living out our desires, to see him more clearly, to love him more dearly, so as to follow him more nearly. To what degree do I choose to compromise living my faith in the midst of a dominant culture that can oftentimes degrade or twist or completely ignore gospel values? Where do I choose not to compromise the integrity of living out my faith? I also then look and just say, how do I be faithful to that which has formed me? How do I live that out with integrity in another world, in a more dominant world? In other words, again, to follow the words of Jesus, how do I recognize that I am in this world, but my values really go beyond this world? How am I really invited to be salt for the world? How am I invited to be yeast? So what I draw out of Jared's lecture and presentation today is the whole sense of a power structure that is somehow imposing itself, or that lures us into something that can mislead us. We can be misled into something. We can lose our identity, or we can approach it with a sense of identity and assist in transforming it. So I focus on this image. How do we be catchers of people? How do we realize what net have I been caught into for good and for not so good? How am I invited to be the disciples that somehow in this present dominant culture, how do I be one who captures the hearts of others by giving hope, by giving purpose, by giving meaning to others? Maybe another way of putting it is in using those 2 words that Jared ended with. How do I recognize who I am? And how do I adapt who I am into a dominant culture? How do I preserve who I am in face of a dominant culture? So a few things to chew on. At this point too, I would just simply, again, just say, thank you for your participation in today's program. Special thank you to Jared. And we'll look forward to seeing you all next week. And Frederick, I think you have some final words for us.
Yes, so next week, Jared will explore Jewish communities and identities in the Second Temple period. looking those names we are familiar with without really knowing maybe who is who. And we'll have a visit also of Qumran. So we are really looking forward to seeing you all next week. All our friends here, I can see Sheena and Peter and Colleen. It's very nice to see you again. Waiting to maybe seeing you in person. Let's pray things will change and that we will be able to finally, thank you also for your donations. You might have seen that there were some small issues because we are trying to, it's the first time we are doing this, so be patient with us. But thank you very much for your generosity for this program, and see you next.
Have a good week all.